अंजलि मैम,
आई थिंक कुछ नेटवर्क इशू होगा। सुन भाई आप स्टार्ट कर दीजिए ना।
उन्होंने ज्वाइन किया हुआ है। एक सेकंड।
अच्छा, यस 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 लेट्स सी। I think all the participants can switch on their videos. अच्छा है ना, ग्रुप डिस्कशन हो जाएगा अच्छा सा. You all will be having a very close and discussion.
There is some technical issue over at the end of the agreement, so we are starting. So let's start. I would request everyone to put right hand on the heart for the ICI motto first.
येष सुप्तेषु जागृति येष सुप्तेषु जागृति कामं 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 कामपुरुषो पुरुषो निर्विमाणः निर्विमाणः तदेव शुक्रं तद्ब्रह्मा तद्ब्रह्मा तदेवामृतमुच्यते तस्मिन् लोकः शितः सर्वे तदूनात्यपि कश्चन एतद्वैता 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 एतद्वैता.
Now I would request Chairman Ahmedabad Branch Sri Harit B. Dhariwal to give the opening remarks.
Yeah, respected faculty for today's session, CA Karan Subramani, the chairman of the DT committee, Sunil Sangvi, all the participants who have joined us, and the secretary of the branch, Anjali Choksi, and all the participants who have joined us. A very good evening to all of you, and welcome to this very interesting and a very unique session on the multilateral instrument in section 195. This is a very specialized topic, and I think when I was discussing with Karan, this is something which, you know, it's an emerging area of practice, but there are very few practitioners who are actually dealing in this topic. So you know what, though the presence is limited, we'll rather take it as a study group discussion wherein we can go in detail in this topic. And I'm sure a lot of people will be, you know, all the members will be going to the YouTube channel later on and also seeing this lecture, because it's going to be an amazing session on the very important aspect of the multilateral instrument and the section 195. Thank you, Karan, for accepting our invitation for this. I'll just brief you about the Ahmedabad branch activities which are upcoming. First, we are having our Diwali get together on 17th of November at Ambagan. And thank you for the wonderful registration and the response that you have got, that, you know, we had to close it within 24 hours. So thanks for all the participation. We are coming up with a special series on FEMA that is under the pipeline. We have, you know, more than 50 hours of dedicated learning on FEMA, all the rules and RBI circulars, everything. We are going to club it in that. And I'm sure, you know, some part of it will be even maybe covered by Karan also today, because FEMA and this is very much interlinked. But yes, very you know, the series that we all are looking forward to on the FEMA. We are also coming up with a GST refresher course again, that is coming up soon, and something on the direct taxes which Sunil Bhai is working on that as well. In the first week of January, we are having our winter RRC at Udaipur. The details will be out soon, and that will be, apart from the traditional areas of practice, we are going to discuss a lot of non-traditional, new emerging areas, and basically also on the leadership and other very other important aspects which, you know, we normally don't consider when we go into professional practice. So it's going to be an amazing RRC. Details will be out soon. So with this, I once again thank Karan for today's session, and over to you, Sunil Bhai. I think Anjali Bhai has joined now.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Chairman. We are having with us Secretary Anjali Choksi, today's faculty Karan Subramani, my friend, coordinator Jiten Trivedi, and all dear participants. Happy New Year to all of you. We have started our office after the Diwali vacation. Yes, you were saying something, Chairman? Oh, okay. As Chairman said, we are planning the special session of 7-8 session on the direct tax litigation cases basis only. let's say we are having the 5 head, so one session would be on the particular salary, on the cases on the salary or the business or the capital gains like that. So that is under planning, and maybe we will announce soon within a week. I would request now the coordinator CA Jiten Bhai Trivedi to introduce the today's faculty, CA Karan Sukhramani, who is going to deliver on the MLI and the section 195 of the Income Tax Act.
Thank you, Sunil sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, Jitin.
Okay. It gives me immense pleasure to give introduction of such a prolific speaker, CA Karan Sukhramani sir. Sir is a senior associate at Dhinal Shah Associates Legal and Tax Counseling and is based in Ahmedabad. Prior to joining DSA, he has worked with E&Y Ahmedabad and TCS Mumbai. Karan sir is a qualified chartered accountant from ICI and a prolific speaker, having over 7 years of experience in the field of domestic and international tax, with specific emphasis on tax litigations and transfer pricing. Karan sir has done extensive research work in tax subject and regularly writes columns relating to recent developments in transfer pricing and international taxation, including BEPS and digital economy, for some of the most popular journals and publications issued by professional forums, including ICI, IFA India, and regional professional associations. Sir is closely associated with International Tax Committee and regularly updates the key publications of ICI, such as Aspect of International Tax and background material for Diploma in International Taxation for professionals. He has addressed and presented papers at various seminars on various topics related to international taxation and topics of generally public importance. Karan sir has assisted some of the leading multinational groups of tax and transfer pricing litigations, advisory, unilateral and bilateral advanced pricing agreements. Karan sir has been an integral part of the team representing one of the largest IT company in India before revenue authorities in United Kingdom, United States of America, and Australia. I would like to thank CS Sunil Sanghvi sir and Chairman sir, Harit sir, and Secretary ma'am for giving me opportunity to give introduction of such a prolific speaker. And now I will ask Karan sir to take up the session and continue with the meeting. Thank you so much.
Before that, let's have a big round of applause for the Karan.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Over to you, Karan.
Thank you, Sunil, sir. Respected Chairman, Ahmedabad branch of WIRC of ICAI, Shri Harit Dhariwalji. Secretary, Ahmedabad branch of WIRC, Anjali Ben. Sunil Sanghvi, sir, who has been my teacher since I joined the profession, who has taught me the tax on the very first day of my joining the profession. Shri Sunil Sanghvi, sir, who is also the chairman of the Direct Tax Committee of ICAI, Ahmedabad branch. I really thank you for having me here today on this evening for this virtual session on one of the very important topic. And of course, as rightly pointed out, Mr. Harit Dhariwalji, it's going to be the area of practice very soon, I would say, because the sheer force of international or the cross-border transaction that has increased over the last couple of years is basically necessitates some of the changes on a very frequent basis in the international tax area. So with this, I will start the session. We all know that over the last 2 decades, we have seen that businesses today have become global. But at the same time, the taxes are local. Each country has a sovereign right to tax its residents for their worldwide income. In respect of non-resident, the country basically tries to tax the income that non-resident derives from the source country by virtue of several connecting factors. Say, having an asset situated in India, the country will have a right to tax that country. Having activities in India or a business connection in India, country will again have a right to tax that non-resident. By virtue of a payment which arises from India, irrespective of having a connecting factor, again, the domestic law says that we'll tax that non-resident. So for a non-resident, from perspective of a non-resident, what exactly happens? If a company is non-resident from India tax perspective, it will have to pay the tax in India by virtue of having source in India, but at the same time, where it is resident, it will again be subject to tax in its home country. So therefore, there is a double taxation that happens on every transaction that non-resident enters. So what countries do or did actually to avoid this double taxation? Because there is the interplay or of the interaction of the domestic law of two countries. So businesses were at loss. So what the country did, they entered into agreements. They signed the agreements which are called as double tax avoidance agreement, or popularly known as tax treaties, whereby the right of the countries to tax a person are divided, or we can say that the income is sort of divided between two countries on a very logical manner, on a very rational manner, and respective country can then tax those taxpayers. So far so good. I'll now share the presentation. Just give me a moment. Sangvi sir, is it visible? I hope it is visible to everyone.
Sir, it is
So-
visible.
It's visible now. Okay, thanks. So I have divided this presentation into 4 parts. Broadly, we'll discuss section 195 of the Income Tax Act. A very quick recap of the section. Most of us are aware of this section. Then we'll just quickly touch upon briefly again the BAP section plans. Then we'll have an in-depth discussion on the topic of multilateral instrument, each of the article that it contains, which are basically related or most relevant from the withholding tax perspective. We'll see some of the case studies, and we'll see the most important part at the end of the session as to what a chartered accountant needs to take care of while signing the Form 15CB for the foreign remittances. So starting with section 195 of the Income Tax Act, just give me a moment. So as you all know, section 195, so chapter 17B of the Indian Income Tax Act basically contains 2 types of withholding tax provision. One is related to when you are making payment to domestic residents, you need to deduct the tax at appropriate rate, which is specified in the section itself. From the recipient's perspective, the TDS, which is deducted on any transaction, that credit is allowed to that resident against its final tax liability at the time of filing the tax return. So we can say that fairly for the domestic transaction, the TDS that we pay is not the final tax liability. However, when it comes to payment to any non-resident or to a foreign company, in that case, section 195 requires that we need to deduct the tax at source in respect of a sum which is chargeable to tax in India. So therefore, what is the rate that we are talking about? There's no mention of the rate in section 195. It says that we need to deduct the tax at the rates in force. Rates in force are defined in section 237A of the Act, which says that rates in force would mean the rates which are specified in the Finance Act of the respective years in respect of the specified transactions, or alternatively, the rates which are prescribed in the DTAA, which has been signed by India with the respective country under section 94 of the Income Tax Act. Whichever is more beneficial, we adopt that rate and we deduct the tax. And when we are availing the benefit of DTAA, we are conscious of the fact that we need to maintain certain documentation. The documentation, like as a chartered accountant, I ask the copy of agreements for the transactions on which TDS needs to be deducted. We ask the copy of invoices. We verify the nature of remittance. If we are taking the benefit of tax treaty, then we ask the tax residency certificates, or if the TRC is not available, usually the department says that treaty benefit will not be granted to you. Or in a recent judgment of SCAPS Industry, Ahmedabad Tribunal has very wonderfully dealt with this issue and said that if you are claiming the benefit of tax treaty, and if you are not having the TRC with you, then in the absence of TRC, you can still claim the benefit of treaty if you are able to substantiate by way of some other document that you are resident of a foreign jurisdiction. Say, for example, you are filing a tax return in the jurisdiction, you are filing some documentation with the corporate affair ministry of the jurisdiction, or else you are, let's say, having the presence in that jurisdiction by way of incorporation in that jurisdiction. So it's very debatable, but you can still take the benefit of tax treaty. If the tax residency certificate doesn't contain the particulars which are required to be contained as per Rule 21AB, then you have to additionally obtain Form 10F from the non-resident payee. Then it is customary to obtain a declaration if the transaction relates to, let's say, making payment on account of royalty, fees for technical services, or else dividend or interest, to have a no PE declaration that foreign payee does not have a permanent establishment. Permanent establishment, in simple term, I would say it's business connection, or it's not having any kind of business presence in India. We take a declaration from that foreign party, and we also take a declaration that the person who is receiving the payment is actually the beneficial owner of that income. And finally, LOB clause, we'll deal with this aspect later. This is what we do as of now prior to the multilateral instrument. Now, what led to the birth of the multilateral instrument, and what significant impact it is going to create so far as the foreign remittances are concerned? Now we'll start that session. What was happening actually prior to 2000? I mean, it's still happening. That countries, the objective of tax treaty, as we discussed, is to avoid the double taxation, to divide the revenue between two countries on some logical and rational manner. However, the multinational companies or the taxpayers were using the tax treaty to avoid paying tax in any of those jurisdictions. Now, tax treaties are not similar. They may be structured in the same way, but the rates which are contained in the tax treaty or the clauses of the tax treaty, there may be minor change depending upon the country. Say, for example, if you are making payment for fees for included services to US, the tax rate is 15%. Whereas if the same nature of payment you are making to another country, there may not be FTS clause, let's say Singapore, or if you are making payment to Colombia, the tax rate may be 10% or 5%, depending upon the country involved. So what taxpayers were doing, they were using the tax treaty in such a manner that they avoid paying tax in any of those countries. Now, this is popularly known as eroding the base of the country. Say, for example, a US company wants to do business in India. It wants to make an investment into India. It has two options. It can directly set up a subsidiary in India. If it is setting up a subsidiary in India, it will be governed by the domestic law of India. Subsidiary will pay tax in India, and subsidiary, when it's going to repatriate the money to US in the form of, let's say, dividend, there will be a tax implication. Under the domestic law, tax rate is 20% plus surcharge. Under the treaty, the tax rate is, hypothetically, let's assume it is 15%. So whichever is beneficial, it will be 15%. Now, in the same situation, let's say USA does not invest directly into India. It set up a subsidiary in Colombia, and Colombia again set up a subsidiary in India. In that situation, what happens? The funds will flow from US to Colombia, from Colombia to India. In Colombia, they might strategically develop a sum or a minimum level of substance. What will happen? If you read the tax treaty between India and Colombia, the tax withholding rate is 5%. So the same nature of payment, if I'm making from India to Colombia, it's attracting the withholding of 5%, which previously, had it been the direct remittance to US, it is 15%. Similarly, take another example, which is very famous, a Mauritius route, which is no more now. Previously, what used to happen, we have a wonderful case of Azadi Bachao Andolan as well, wherein the countries were not directly investing into India, they were investing into Mauritius route. What was the reason? In the 1982, what happened? India was in dire need of foreign exchange reserves. So what it did, it was signing the tax treaty with the countries, and it was giving a lot of favors to those countries in order to attract the foreign direct investment. So it signed a treaty with Mauritius, whereas it gave the capital gain rights to Mauritius. So if a person is having shares in an Indian company and the person is resident of Mauritius, and on transfer of that shares, he is not supposed to pay capital gain tax in India by virtue of tax treaty between India and Mauritius. So what used to happen? Countries instead of investing directly in India, they used to come through the Mauritius route. This is popularly known as a treaty shopping arrangement. What government in the case of Azad Bachao Andolan, I'll just take 1 minute. What happened? The similar transaction was subject to scrutiny and matter traveled all the way to Supreme Court. Supreme Court says that treaty shopping is permissible. The reason being, if you read the tax treaty, there is no any anti-avoidance rule. Additionally, in the tax treaty, if we read the preamble, the objective is to basically encourage the investment as well as avoid the double taxation. Nowhere it is mentioned that treaty shopping arrangement will not be permissible. So what happened exactly? It allowed the case of the assessee, and assessee finally won. So now what is happening? There are a lot of similar issues. There are thousands of issues. So what happened? The issues were being faced by developing as well as the developed countries. So they came together. They met the OECD, G20 countries, sort of taxpayers. What they did, they started identifying those issues. They prepared such research reports. Now those research reports are called as BAPS action plan. 15 action plans were devised, and all those action plans were categorized. Say, for example, some of the action plans were based on the consistency or coherence. Some of the action plans were based on the substance. Some of the action plans were related to, promoting the transparency and certainty for the taxpayer. Some were the industry specific action. One was the industry specific action plan 1, addressing the tax challenges of the digital economy. And the last action plan was related to execution. That is action plan 15, which we are going to study today. I'll just briefly touch upon each of the action plans, a very quick snapshot. The action plan 1 relates to digital economy. We all know that Facebook, Netflix, or Google, all those are the US companies. They assume, let's for a moment, they do not have any business presence in India. What they do, they earn a huge revenue from the India, similarly from the other countries, Europe and other regions, Asia Pacific regions, but they were not paying any kind of taxes there. Basically, our tax systems were enacted at the time when there was a brick and mortar business model. You were having a physical presence in that country, and it was very easy to tax those entities. But now it's all virtual. So how to tax those digital medium driven companies? That was an issue, and they came out with action plan 1, and we have seen significant economic presence equalization levy as the outcome of those action plans in India. Then action plan 2, neutralizing the effect of hybrid mismatch arrangement. So this was basically related to, let's say, in the same example, US, Colombia, India. US is, or let's take another example for easy understanding. Let's say I am borrowing some money from a parent company which is based in Netherlands, and the borrowing is in the form of convertible instrument. So from the India perspective, I will treat this as a debt, and whatever payment I will make periodically, that will be treated as interest. Now, let's say from Netherlands perspective, hypothetically, that's convertible instrument is an equity instrument. So whatever it receives, it's form of dividend. Now, for both the transaction, let's say the tax rate is different. So because the country specific identifies a particular instrument or looks at it from a different perspective, the entire tax impact or the tax rate changes. So people were taking benefit of this kind of arrangement. Then we have CFC. I'll not discuss this because we have POEM in India, and many of you would be aware, place of effective management. Action plan 4 related to limiting the base erosion via interest deduction. In the multinational structure, what companies were planning, the companies which were cash rich, they were being placed in a jurisdiction, or the companies which were highly leveraged, having a lot of debt on their balance sheet, they were being placed in a jurisdiction with a very high tax rate. So therefore, they were eroding the tax base by way of making payment of interest. This happens in locally also in India. So this was the problem. So we introduced Section 94B in the Indian Income Tax Act, 30% of EBITDA. Then Action Plan 5, countering harmful tax practice more effectively. What used to happen in Europe or other regions, there's a concept of private rulings. So if a company, let's say Apple, it wants to invest in Europe, or let's say in Ireland, hypothetically, it will approach the government of Ireland. It will obtain a favorable tax ruling. It used to obtain the favorable tax ruling, and government used to give the favorable tax ruling and a lot of concession on a private basis. The reason being to get the FDI into that country for the economic development. So people started noticing that, and finally, the outcome was whenever you are entering into such kind of arrangement, or say, for example, we have in India APA, Advanced Pricing Agreement and Safe Harbor rules. If we are entering into any advanced pricing agreement with the government of India, APA is basically, it's something in a simple way. If I say, you go to the government of India and you tell them their business model, you tell them that you are entering into a cross-border transaction on a routine basis with your related parties, and this is your business model, and you are remunerating yourself or your subsidiary in a particular fashion or a manner, and this is the margin you are keeping and your subsidiary keeping. Now, Indian government might give you a certainty by signing an agreement with you, which is called as advanced pricing agreement, and you can simply rely on that APA, and there is not going to be any dispute so far as India is concerned. But what happens with the other country? So what they have done, if you are entering into any kind of arrangement, advanced ruling or APA, you have to compulsorily share the information with the other country on an automatic exchange basis. So this is what Action Plan 5 talks about in a simple way. Action 6 to 7, preventing the treaty abuse and preventing the artificial avoidance of PE, we'll deal with it later because it's a part of MLI. Action 8 to 10 again is related to transfer pricing. I'll not get into it because that's not a subject today. Action Plan 11, 12 are related to, again, transparency and reporting of the transaction. 13 is very important. We have seen Section 286(1) of the Income Tax Act, which says that if a company having a turnover of more than 5,500 or 750 million euros, it will have to report its international operations by way of filing a master file, not only its home country jurisdiction, but also wherever it is having the constituent entity, say subsidiary or a branch, so that one gets a global picture of how much you are earning in which country and how much tax you are paying in which country. Action Plan 14 is about the dispute resolution process. They have given certain options like minimum mutual agreement procedure. They are encouraging that, and they are also introduced the concept of arbitration, wherein if you are unable to resolve a cross-border taxation dispute through a mutual agreement procedure, they are suggesting one of the wonderful way called dispute resolution through the arbitration, wherein a third party would be involved and the view of that party would be binding, and it's going to be a time-bound process, unlike our High Court, Tribunal, Supreme Court, which takes years. The mandatory binding arbitration will be a very time-bound process. So this is a very brief idea about what the BEPS action plans are all about. So we have identified the problem, fine. We have identified the solution, fine. Now the question is how to implement them. So one of the ways is you amend your domestic law, but that is possible only in respect of some of the action plans. So to say that, let's say Action Plan 13, you can change your domestic law and introduce this requirement. And say, for example, Action Plan 4, limiting base erosion, we have Section 94B, we have introduced that, and consequently, we can now see that that a section has become effective for domestic as well as foreign country. But there are other action plans which cannot be implemented by changing simply a domestic law. There has to be a consensus-driven approach, and therefore, those action plans require the changing the definitions or changing the provisions which are there in the tax treaty, because what was happening, the companies were evading the taxes or avoiding the taxes by using the treaty shopping arrangement or variety of arrangement through using the tax treaties. So they thought of amending the tax treaty itself by way of some mechanism. So what was that mechanism? One mechanism was individually each and country bilaterally discuss with other country as to how it is going to implement the action plan. But that would require a huge amount of resource, a dialogue, a time. So it is not feasible because we have developed the action plan in 2015, and typically a change in the tax treaty requires years of dialogue. Say, for example, Mauritius. We have been discussing with the Mauritius tax authority since last 15 years to change the capital gain article, and it finally saw the light of the day in 2017. So you can see, just to make a one change, it requires years because there are a lot of political consensus and political issues that are involved before we change the tax treaty. So what was the solution? They identified that let's develop one agreement. In that agreement, let's put in what all changes we want to see pursuant to the action plans that we have worked out. They put in on the paper. Then they asked, let's do one thing. Let's ask the country to sign this document. Again, it becomes a difficult task because I don't want to sign. Mauritius would say, I don't want to sign a particular clause with the India. Similarly, other country would say, I don't want to sign this because this is already there in my tax treaty. Country would say that I have a reservation against a particular article, I'm not going to see. So what they did, they tweaked the idea. They said that we'll again have a same agreement called as multilateral instrument. It's the same agreement, but we'll give them some flexibility. Flexibility in terms of a particular provision will apply to which country. That flexibility will be given. If you don't want, if you're not happy with out of 20 solutions, you're not happy with one solution, get out of it. If you want to, you can't recommend anything new. You have got options A, B, C for a particular issue. You can select any of those options. So these are the options that were given in a particular agreement, multilateral instrument. We'll see all those issues of options and how to apply this multilateral instrument now. So what they did, they said that in the agreement, we'll keep certain minimum standard. What is minimum standard? Minimum standard, in a simple way, if I say they are the solutions which they have worked out, they need to be agreed, and the tax treaty has to be amended or modified as per the solutions recommended, either to the multilateral instrument, and if it is not, if it is not done, in that case, it is compulsory for the countries to bilaterally amend the tax treaty with that country, having the clause similar to those which is described in the BEPS action plan. Then there are certain common approaches and best practice for the domestic law. We have seen that hybrid mismatch, CFC and interest. CFC is basically, it's a brother of POEM, I would say. Then reinforced international standard, permanent establishment and transfer pricing, analytical report, digital economy and MLI, that digital economy we discussed. So what is MLI? MLI is a single instrument which is going to modify, or which has actually started modifying, the concerned bilateral tax treaties in a very synchronized and a fast manner. That too, and additionally in a consistent manner. We'll see how it is happening. MLI involves one negotiation. You don't have to approach each and every country individually. Okay, sir, we'll change this clause with you. We'll introduce this clause or this change with you. No, that's not going to happen. There will be one negotiation in the meeting wherein representatives of all the countries will be present. There will be one signature. There will not be multiple signature for each of those countries. There will be one ratification. What is the impact? On the first signing, so globally today we know that there are 3,000 plus tax treaties, and today more than 1,200 tax treaties have been modified in just one signature at the signing ceremony, and there are more that are, I think, as on date, if I say there are 1,600 plus tax treaties which have been modified. Around half of the tax treaties in the world have been already modified and into effect because of this signature process and ratification. What are the action plans that are sought to be implemented by way of multilateral instrument? One is the hybrid mismatch. One is treaty abuse. Then action 7, permanent and avoidance of P, permanent establishment exposure, artificial arrangements, and action plan 14, dispute resolution. These are basically the action plans which are sought to be introduced in the multilateral instrument and sought to be implemented by the countries by way of the multilateral instrument. What is the legal status of multilateral instruments? It's very important to understand that multilateral instrument is not, I would say, a tax treaty. Tax treaty as it will remain as it is. Multilateral instrument is also not a protocol. We have seen that earlier whenever government wanted to change any clauses of the tax treaty, they used to approach the government. And if there is a change in any of the definition or clauses, they used to give an annexure just at the end of the tax treaty by way of a protocol. And that protocol effectively amends the definition or the clauses of the tax treaty. MLI is not that. MLI is an additional instrument which has to be read along with the tax treaty. In a simple way, I say that yes, it amends the tax treaty, but it has to be read along with the tax treaty. It does not replace the tax treaty. It simply modifies the tax treaty in its application. We'll see what provisions are modified and how they are going to affect us from the India perspective. So this we discussed. MLI is a speedy approach. It bilaterally, rather than bilaterally negotiating each and every treaty, it amends more than 1500 tax treaty. It has amended in just one stroke. It brings in consistency. It brings in clarity and transparency. If we are having, let's say, bilaterally, if we negotiate, there's not going to be consistency. There's going to be a word here or there, and that will completely change the interpretation. So in MLI, there's an explanatory statement given, just like in a model convention, there is the commentary given. In case of MLI also, there is an explanatory statement which actually interprets the MLI. So that can be an aid to an interpretation. It's very flexible. We'll see how it is. Just quickly, the features of MLI. MLI respects the sovereign power of signatory or country. So as I said, if you are a party to the BEPS action plans, you have been working tirelessly for developing those action plans. It is not compulsory that you have to be the part of them. You can bilaterally negotiate. You can say that the provisions which are there in MLI, they are already there in my tax treaty, so I won't go for it. You cannot be a part of it, but yes, that would be subject to minimum standards. Minimum standard means some mandatory minimum provisions. US, which was a driving force for this development of MLI, it's not a part of MLI, surprisingly, because it says that all of its tax treaties are already very strong and there's no need to sign the MLI. If there is any provision which is not there in its tax treaty with the other country, it will bilaterally negotiate in a very short frame of time and it will change that in accordance with the MLI. China, it's a part of MLI, it's a part of BEPS action plan, but it has not notified India. So it respects the sovereign power of each and every country. MLI, as I said, it sits alongside the treaty. It modifies their operation, but it does not replace them. MLI is a dynamic document. It provides various sort of flexibility in terms of allowing the countries to give reservations, allowing the countries to withdraw even from the MLI, but within the particular time frame. MLI does not preclude the subsequent bilateral negotiation. If you enter into MLI and notify a particular provision, that does not mean that you can't change it again. You can again, by entering into a bilateral negotiation with the country, again change what has already been agreed in the MLI. So it's that flexible. Synthesized tax and matching tool, we'll discuss it later. This is a process. I'll just take a few minutes to discuss this. First, there was an adoption of MLI. Then there was a signature ceremony which happened wherein the provisional list was shared by each of the country, highlighting, let's say India is 90 plus tax treaty, 93 or 94. India gave a list of all the countries saying that whatever is mentioned in the MLI, I mean, not whatever exactly, some of the provisions that India wants to adopt of the MLI, it will notify all the tax treaties to be changed. And that was happened at the time of signing the MLI. Ratification is nothing but a process whereby, so just to give us an important background, whenever a country is signing a tax treaty, it has to gain certain power to sign the tax treaty. So in Indian context, Constitution of India, Article 253 allows the country to sign the tax treaty, whether it is a tax treaty or any other treaty, any kind of treaty with any other country. Pursuant to that, Parliament has given the power under section 9090 of the Income Tax Act to Government of India to sign a tax treaty under the Income Tax Act for the taxation matters. Therefore, for this signing the tax treaty, it is gaining the authority under section 90 of the tax treaty. So after signature, the OECD wants that each and every MLI, each and every country should ratify it. Ratify means take a formal approval of your respective country. So there are two processes. And the Indian context, executive has the power to ratify it, whereas in other countries, say for example in Australia, they have to formally go through the parliamentary process. But that will happen once only. Reservation, if you are not agreeing to some of the provisions, you can just give your reservations. Similarly, you have to file a list of notifications wherein the provisions have been made applicable. Once the provisions are made, let's say, we'll understand in detail, but giving just a small example. Let's say India says that it will introduce a concept called principal purpose test, which is just another version of the GAR, domestic GAR that we have in the tax treaty, and it notifies all the countries, more particularly China. But China says that I'm a part of MLI, but I won't notify India. So in that case, the tax treaty, which was there prior to MLI, still remains there even after MLI with respect to the one clause principal purpose test. However, let's take an example of Singapore. India has notified Singapore for the purpose of PPT, hypothetically. Singapore has also notified India for the purpose of principal purpose test. So that agreement, the tax treaty which is there, is called as cover tax agreement. It's not a new agreement. Just for the purpose of, or for the sake of interpretation, we call it a cover tax agreement. Then we have a date of entry into force and date of entry into effect. I think that's a very important session, but I'll just topic to discuss, which takes almost 1 or 2 hours, but I'll just briefly explain what is date of entry into force and date of entry into effect by way of an example. As I said, each country is required to deposit the multilateral instrument. So India deposited the multilateral instrument on 25th June 2019. If that is the date, then what is the date of entry into force? Entry into force is to be computed in this manner. This is provided in the MLI itself. It will be the first day of the month after expiry of 3 months from the date of deposit of the ratified copy. So India deposited on 25th June. You have to compute the first day of the month after expiry of 3 months. So 3 months expire on July, August, September. Then 1st of October, from India perspective, will be the date of entry into force of the MLI provisions. But once entry into force is there, you can't implement the MLI. There has to be an entry into effect. So how to calculate that? It's very complex, but I'll just try to explain it in a simple fashion. For calculating the entry into effect, you have to see the relevant date. What is relevant date? Let's try to understand through an example. Let's take an example of India-Singapore. For India, as we discussed, the date of entry into force is 1st October 2019. Whereas Singapore deposited the instrument in the year December 2018. Therefore, its date of entry into force after 3 months become 1st April 2019. So from Singapore perspective, it is 1st April. From India perspective, it is 1st October. Whichever is later, that we will count as a relevant date, a common date. Now, if we read the structure of the tax treaty, it's divided into 2 parts. There are certain provisions which deal with the withholding tax rate. There are certain other provisions which does not provide any withholding tax rate, but they are related to taxes. Say, for example, FTS, royalty, dividend, all those articles or interest are related to withholding tax. Whereas a taxation of a permanent establishment, fixed base, independent personal service, entertainment, sports person, for all those, these are the other tax matters. So there are different dates provided for each of those clauses. So if we try to understand for the date entry into effect for the withholding tax purpose, it is the first day of next taxable year. So what is the relevant date? 1st October 2019. Therefore, thereafter, we have to immediately see which is the first day of the next taxable year. Next taxable year is the financial year 2021. 1st April 20 to 31st March 21. So that 1st April 2020 would be the entry into effect from an India perspective in relation to India-Singapore tax treaty read with the multilateral instrument. Whatever changes that are supposed to be brought in by way of MLI will be effective from the 1st April 20 from the India perspective. Similarly, from the Singapore perspective, it is going to be the 1st Jan 2020. Now, this is very important as on date. The reason being, whatever remittances we have been making these days, foreign remittances to Singapore or to any other country, for example, we have to check whether the tax treaty between India and Singapore is getting affected by MLI. To check that, we need to draw this diagram and see what is the entry into effect date. If the entry into effect date is 1st April 20, then yes, that withholding tax provision will be governed by and it will be subject to the provisions contained in the multilateral instrument, otherwise not. So similarly, for other countries, there may be other dates, we'll see. In the context of Canada, there are different rates. I will not discuss it because we have discussed Singapore in detail. Mechanics. Does the multilateral instrument apply at all? This is the first question we need to answer and ask ourselves. And then second question, which provisions of the MLI are going to be applied? First, does the MLI apply at all? So you need to check whether both the countries have signed the MLI. Question 2. So let's stop there. Have both the countries signed the MLI? If answer is no, either of the country has not signed the MLI, in that case, the tax treaty between these two countries will not be affected by way of through the MLI, because there has to be a consensus at both the ends and there has to be a signature and ratification at both ends. Whether the MLI has entered into force in both the countries, if answer is no, MLI will not apply. If answer is yes, go ahead. Has the treaty been notified as a CTA? So once the MLI is ratified by way of some domestic law process, it has to be deposited with the OECD depository. That is formally or legally called as notification of the MLI. Has that happened? If answer is yes, then the MLI is into effect, subject to the dates which we discussed. Then let's come to the provision, whether either country has made a reservation of the application of MLI. If there are a number of provisions in the MLI and against one such provision country has given a reservation, then that's not applicable. Whether both the countries have chosen to apply an optional provision, if there are a variety of options given to adopt a particular solution against one problem, then we have to see whether that option is there or not. Whether both the countries have chosen to adopt the same option or not, that also needs to be seen. So as of now, so far, we have been discussing this concept very hypothetically, but now we actually deal with what the MLI actually contains. We'll come to the heart of the MLI. We'll discuss the compatibility clauses at later stage if we have a time. Let's understand. We have discussed briefly the decision of Supreme Court in the case of Azadi Bachao Andolan 263 ITR 706. In that decision, the Supreme Court gave favor to the taxpayer, and it basically one of the main reason of giving the favor was the preamble to the tax treaty between India and Mauritius. Similar decisions have been rendered in India as well as in other countries. So the issue came as to why not change the preamble itself. Preamble is not a part of a treaty. There's a two answer to it, but it's basically it's not a provision in the tax treaty or an article of a tax treaty. It's just a background of the tax treaty. Preamble is there in every statute. We know that. Similarly, tax treaty also has a preamble. So they said that we'll make a clear statement that the purpose of tax treaty is of course to avoid the double taxation, but the purpose of tax treaty is not to avoid or not to have a double non-taxation. That is, you don't end up paying in tax any of the country. That is not the purpose of tax treaty. Through tax treaty, you can reduce your burden. You cannot eliminate your tax burden. So that is the purpose of tax treaty, which they have made it very clear. And this is a minimum standard, and it has to be adopted by all the countries. If a country has not adopted, it's supposed to bilaterally negotiate the tax treaty. This is one. Then we have a PPT rule, principal purpose test. Just have a background of GAR in your mind when you hear this word, principal purpose test. If one of the principal purpose of the arrangement or or a transaction per se is to obtain the benefit of tax treaty, then the benefit of tax treaty would be denied, because that's the purpose of principal purpose of arrangement. Your transaction is not driven through the commercial rationale or some commercial substance. Then there is an LOB rule, limitation of benefit. PPT is a very subjective test, whereas LOB is an objective test, though India has opted for it. But as of now, it is not applicable in most of the India's tax treaties, since the other countries have opted for the principal purpose test. OECD has given 3 options to every country. You either adopt PPT alone, you go for PPT plus LOB, that is detailed or as simplified version of the limitation of benefit clause, or you take a detailed limitation of benefit clause and mutually negotiate the anti-contribute rule with the other country. For those who are not familiar with these terms or with these concepts, we will try to now get into more detail. So this we discussed, preamble of the tax treaty, that will now get modified to this language after MLI. So whenever you read the tax treaty, you find this language existing. After the MLI, you will find this language. It will not be a tax treaty. It will not be a part of tax treaty, but it will be a part of MLI, which is applicable to the tax treaty. That says, purpose of tax treaty is to eliminate double taxation with respect to taxes covered by this agreement without creating opportunities for non-taxation or reduced taxation through tax evasion or avoidance, including through treaty shopping arrangement aimed at obtaining relief provided in this agreement for the indirect benefit of resident of third jurisdiction. This is basically for the purpose of interpretation in case there arises any dispute. This is one of the most important article of the multilateral instrument, which is significantly going to change the landscape of the international taxation. Let's understand and learn this very important article very closely. What it says: notwithstanding any provisions of a covered tax agreement, a benefit under the tax treaty or a covered tax agreement, it shall not be granted in respect of an item of income or a capital if it is reasonable to conclude that all relevant facts, considering all relevant facts and circumstances, that obtaining that benefit was one of the principal purpose of the arrangement or a transaction that results directly, indirectly into that benefit. This is a reasonable purpose test. It starts with non-obstant clause. It says notwithstanding. So this disregards all the provisions of the tax treaty, or for that sake, even it's debatable, but the domestic tax, no, not domestic, but it's only tax treaty. It disregards all the provisions of tax treaty, overrides it if you have obtained a benefit. Now, what is benefit? That is not defined, but benefit in the explanatory statement means it can be a reduced tax rate. It can be a reduced tax rate means what? In which context? Let's say for dividend payment under the domestic law, you have 20% tax rate, whereas in the treaty, the tax rate is 5% or 10%. That's a reduced tax rate. You have obtained the benefit of tax treaty, and that was the principal purpose of entering into that transaction. We'll see this through the case study. However, the section doesn't stop there. It says, unless it is established that granting that benefit in these circumstances would be in accordance with the object and purpose of the provisions of the covered tax agreement. So this is a caveat. Before denying you the benefit of tax treaty, we will see that whether the benefit you are gaining by use of tax treaty, whether it is in accordance with the object and purpose of the tax treaty. If that is the case, we will not disturb your position and we will not take any adverse action. It's fine, you can take the benefit of tax treaty. Let's understand the process first. We'll then deal with the example. You identify a particular transaction. It can be a simple transaction of fees for technical service, or it can be a royalty payment or dividend, or it can be a position related to having a PE or not in India. You compare that arrangement with realistic counterfactual. This means that in a real world, on the commercial basis, whether somebody would enter into that transaction or not, you just make a judgmental call here. Step 3. The benefit or the scale of treaty benefit that you are gaining, an evidence of non-tax business purpose, whether sustains that arrangement not to obtain the treaty benefit. So here it's sort of weighing the benefit which you are gaining by using the tax treaty. You should compare it with the evidences that you have gathered for establishing the reality of the transaction or the commercial or rational of the transaction. Then whether obtaining that benefit is one of the principal purpose or not. So if you are entering into transaction, let's say expanding your business operation, you have multiple jurisdiction at your hand and you are selecting only one jurisdiction. In that case, there can be a couple of advantages. Say, for example, when Apple wanted to manufacture iPhone, it selected India, it evaluated China, Australia, and other countries. It chosen China. The reason was cheaper labor and developed country sort of, and it has a lot of resources. Therefore, it's a lot. It also had some exemptions or tax exemption in that country. So Apple chose China for manufacturing the iPhone. So in that case, whether the benefit of treaty between US and China is the sole consideration for selecting the China, or is it the commercial angle, like having the low labor cost, which is the driving force for setting up the manufacturing in China? So this is the factual analysis that one needs to undertake. If the answer is no to this analysis, in that case, PPT test is satisfied and hence treaty benefit will be granted. However, the answer is yes, that is, the policy decision was driven by the tax considerations. In that case, it's fair to say that you have taken an advantage of a treaty. But yes, stop there. Whether that advantage is in accordance with the object and purpose of the tax treaty, if answer is no, then PPT test would apply and treaty benefit will be denied to you. Let's understand through an example. There is a company called ARCO, which is a resident of state R. It has set up a subsidiary ESCO in the state S. Now, ESCO is declaring the dividend to ARCO. The holding percentage of ARCO in ESCO is 24%. It's not actually a subsidiary. It's a company in which the ARCO has the substantial interest. So holding percentage is 24%. In the tax treaty between ARCO and ESCO, there is a clause which says that generally on payment of dividend by ESCO to ARCO, the withholding will happen at 15% rate. However, if the holding percentage of ARCO in ESCO is more than or is equal to 25%, then the rate will get reduced to 5% instead of 15 or 25%, instead of 15%. And subject to other conditions like beneficial owner and 365 days period holding period that is there. But if the holding percentage is 25%, in that case, the withholding tax rate will get substantially reduced to 5%. So what ARCO did, ARCO had an existing 24% stake. It increased its stake in ESCO by 1% to 25% to take the benefit of tax treaty. So in this case, can we say that this transaction is hit by the principal purpose test and benefit of tax treaty is claimed? And this step of raising the equity from 24 to 25% is not driven through some commercial angle, but it is driven through the tax treaty angle. Answer in reality, yes. But yes, at the same time, we need to remember the principal purpose test says if the granting the benefit of a tax treaty is in accordance with the object and purpose of the treaty, the second limb of the provision, in that case, we will not create any adverse situation for you. You can take the benefit of tax treaty, and this arrangement is permissible under the statute, or rather under the international tax scenario. So this example is actually a part of the web section plan 6, and it says that we will not create any adverse situation for you. Let's take another example. This is very interesting. TECO is T company is a resident of state T. It owns the shares of ESCO, which is resident of state S. ESCO is declaring the dividend. So usually dividends are provided to the shareholder. However, TICO state S if the dividend is declared to state T, there is a withholding tax of 25% under the domestic law of ESCO in state S, and there is no tax treaty between TICO and ESCO. There is a tax treaty between state S and state R, and as per the tax treaty between S and R, there is no withholding tax on the dividend. So what TICO does, TICO enters into an agreement with ARCO, which is resident of state R, and it assigns all the rights to receive the dividend that are declared by ESCO, but that have not yet been paid by ESCO. So the question arises, in this situation, the transaction which would have been subject to taxation at 25% in domestic law of the source country state as, it would get reduced to 0, and source country would be deprived of its right to collect the due taxes merely by reason that TICO has assigned the right of receiving the dividend and keeping the dividend, diverted its right in favor of ARCO. Whether this kind of transaction or arrangement is permissible. OECD says absolutely not. This is simply to obtain the tax treaty benefit. Unless there are commercial reasons or valid reasons in the eyes of law, this type of transaction will not be permitted, and therefore this transaction would be denied the benefit of tax treaty, and consequently domestic law provisions would follow. Let's take another example. We have a company in USA Co. We have a company in Luxembourg as well as in India. Now, Indian company has borrowed some money from Luxembourg in the form of CCD, compulsorily convertible debentures. And on such borrowing, Indian company is going to pay the interest to Luxembourg company. Luxembourg company has borrowed, let's understand reverse way. US has given some money to its subsidiary Luxembourg company in the form of equity contribution. On this equity contribution, it will be entitled to dividend. Luxembourg has in turn given the same money to Indian company. Indian company will pay interest because the form of transaction is in the form of CCD and not the equity investment. So if we look at the rates of the tax treaty between India and Luxembourg, there's a tax treaty rate of 10% on the payment of interest, whereas in India-US context, it's 15%. So what has happened? If the money would have flown directly from USA in the form of CCD, India would have paid interest after deducting tax at 15%. But because there is an intermediate holding company in Luxembourg, the tax rate between the India effectively is deprived of its tax revenue to the extent of 5%. So can the Indian government deny the tax treaty benefit? The answer is yes as well as no. The reason being, in multinational companies, there is often a concept of intermediate holding company, setting up an intermediate holding company which holds the entire cash pool. So say, for example, Apple, it has hundreds of subsidiaries in Asia Pacific region. What it will do? It will identify some jurisdiction, say in Singapore, it will set up a subsidiary company as an IHC, intermediate holding company. And that intermediate holding company will take care of all the rest of the subsidiary in terms of their funding requirement. So the funds will come ultimately from the USA. But in this Apple example, there is a commercial logic or a substance that the intermediate holding company is set up for a coordination purpose, for a management purpose, because size of the organization is such a huge size, it's not possible for a parent company to directly deal with each of its subsidiaries due to whatever may be the reasons. And there's a commercial angle. There may be commercial angle in the form of having skilled manpower or finance professional in Singapore. There may be commercial angle to say that it is easy to find the investor to invest in your company from if you are having a presence in Singapore. So there can be a lot of reasons and it can set up that. If that is the situation, one can argue that principal purpose test is fulfilled I have not violated any of the treaty provision or abused the treaty provision, benefit is available to me. Whereas if there is no commercial substance, Luxembourg company is simply a company without holding shares of any other company or without giving CCT to any other company. It's a sham entity having a very limited number of staff, a paper company. In that case, the benefit of tax treaty will not be given by the Indian authorities. Then what would be the consequence? Let's assume that Luxembourg company is alleged to be established for one of the principal purpose to obtain the benefit of withholding rate on reduced withholding rate on the interest income. So there can be two scenarios or two views. If you are denying me the benefit of tax treaty, a reduced tax rate of 10%, am I covered under the Income Tax Act, which says that, let's say for interest, 10 or a 20% tax rate, depending upon the nature of borrowing, 20% tax rate, should I discharge my liability under the domestic tax law? Or should I then govern myself between India-US tax treaty, since the money has flown from US to Luxembourg and then to India? So should I take the benefit of tax treaty between US and India, or go ahead with the US-India treaty, or should I be governed by the India domestic law provisions? This is an open question. There is no answer to it. What is the logical step that one should take as a tax professional? The logical step would be you go by the domestic tax law provisions, because usually also what we do, if we are having a transaction with non-resident and non-resident does not provide us the tax residency certificate, we tell him that, look, if you are not giving TRC, you are not able to get the benefit of tax treaty, you will be governed by the domestic law provisions, and therefore we will deduct the tax in accordance with the law. So one should go with the domestic law approach, though there are arguments in favor or against, but this is a practical call that one should take. Or alternatively, what can be the other approaches? The first approach we said, you don't deduct you take a conservative approach, go by the domestic law provisions. And if you are going by the domestic law provisions, if you're not going by this, under the domestic law, there's a section 195(2) as well as section 197 of the Income Tax Act, which says that you can approach the tax authority for determination of the withholding tax liability on a particular transaction. If that is possible within the limited time frame, you can very well approach the tax authority. Third option is, if the above two options are not workable or not possible for whatever reason, as a chartered accountant, it is my responsibility not only to look at the transaction, but look through the transaction. What I would do, I would obtain sufficient number of documents from my client as well as a foreign company, so that at least my interest is safeguarded. And on paper, I will establish that yes, there is a commercial substance to the transaction. If there is no commercial substance, then go by the first option, deduct the tax under the domestic law. At the most, what would be the consequences? Consequences would be there will be a higher withholding tax rate at the time of deducting the TDS. You can always ask the foreign company or non-resident that you file the tax return in India, you can claim the treaty benefit if you feel you are entitled to, and you can claim the refund of taxes that you would have paid. So this is the finest approach and a safest approach one can go ahead with. What is the difference between domestic GAR and the Article 7 of MLI that deals with the principal purpose test? If we read the GAR provisions, it says that if the main purpose of the transaction is to obtain the tax benefit, the emphasis is to be given to the word main purpose. So there can be many purposes of handling the transaction, but if the main purpose of the transaction is to obtain the benefit of treaty benefit or the domestic law tax benefit, then the tax authority will have a right to recharacterize your transaction or reallocate your income or deny you the tax treaty benefit. Whereas for the principal purpose test, it says that one of the principal purpose of the transaction is to take the benefit. So there can be several purposes. There can be several principal purposes as well. But if among those several principal purposes, one of the principal purpose is to take the benefit of tax treaty, there's a very thin line difference between both the provisions. However, it is said that the principal purpose test is wider than the domestic GAR, in a sense that it talks about the one of the principal purpose, whereas the domestic GAR says main purpose is to obtain the tax benefit. So one needs to be very careful, because if on a particular transaction we feel that domestic GAR is not applicable, either by virtue of its definition, restrictive definition, or else due to some grandfathering or de minimis threshold. De minimis threshold means GAR can be invoked only if the transaction value or tax benefit exceeds a limit which is prescribed under the domestic GAR. If that doesn't exceed that limit, GAR provisions are not applicable. Whereas that is not the case if the principal purpose test. In PPT, it is irrespective of the value of transaction. Even if you are taking a benefit of 1 rupee under the tax treaty, it can be disregarded if the principal purpose of the arrangement of the transaction is to obtain the tax treaty benefit, not in accordance with the objective of the tax treaty. The primary onus to prove that there's a commercial angle and genuine tax treaty benefit is on the tax authority. This is a theoretical concept, because what tax authority will do, it will simply issue a show cause notice at the first instance that you have obtained the tax treaty benefit in an impermissible way. So it is onus is very easily and conveniently shifted on you. So then the onus lies on the assessee, and which is very practical, to prove that the benefit of tax treaty is taken in accordance with the provisions of the law. SLOB we'll discuss if the time permits, because we have to capture the other articles as well. There's an article 4 of the MLI which deals with the dual resident. If I'm a resident of either of the tax country, we all know that only then I can take the benefit of tax treaty. If the transaction is between India and Australia, and the person concerned is resident of America, you can't take the benefit of India tax treaty. You have to be resident of either of the country. That is the primary condition. But what happened? In case of company or in case of individual also, there can be situation where you are resident of both the countries due to the domestic law of those countries. We have provisions dealing with the place of effective management under Section 6 of the Income Tax Act, wherein a company, if it is controlled and managed from India, it will be deemed to be, or its place of effective management is in India, it will be deemed to be resident of India. So what happens? Those foreign company will become resident of India. The payer who is making payment to that foreign company is also resident of India. Then whether it is possible to take a benefit? Answer is no, because you both are resident of the in India. It's not a foreign remittance. Then what happens? Foreign company will be in issue. How to solve that issue? To solve that issue, they have said that earlier it used to be you determine the place of effective management, and there was a whole lot of issues like domestically you have to dispute with the tax authority. But now they have said that, see, we want you to file an application for a mutual agreement procedure, whereby you will approach the tax authority of both the countries by way of a formal application and leave it to them. And mind well, this is one of the cheapest way of resolving the dispute than disputing with the Indian tax authority through the traditional ways of disputing, because you will simply file an application and you don't have to do anything, and they will among themselves determine you are a resident of which country based on the domestic law of both the country, and their conclusion may not be binding on you. You can continue a dispute, but they'll arrive at a solution. If they are not able to arrive at a solution, the MLI says that you will not be entitled to relief or an exemption of the from the provisions of the tax. You will not be entitled to, in a simple way, take the benefit of tax treaty. However, there might be situation, and they are encouraging this, that the competent authority of both the countries will at least endeavor to arrive at a mutually agreeable solution, and assessee can take the benefit to the extent of solution that they have given. Let's take a hypothetical example. There's a company called ECO, which is formally incorporated in Australia, but the place of effective management of that company is in United Kingdom. So therefore, this is a case of a dual resident entity. A company is resident of both the countries. I'm an Indian company. Let's say I'm making payment for whatever, it can be interest, dividend, royalty. What should I do? Should I read the tax treaty of India, Australia, or should I read the tax treaty of India, UK? It's very confusing, and there is no answer to this question. Practically, as a taxpayer in India or as a chartered accountant, I should insist that ACO gives me the tax residency certificate. Having a poem in two countries or a residential status of two countries is the concern of that ACO. It's not my concern. Let it be resolved by ACO with the respective countries. I'll simply rely on the tax residency certificate, and additionally, I can obtain more documents for my safeguard. A very important Article 8 of the MLI related to dividend transactions. Typically, prior to MLI, what was the provisions that were there in the tax treaty with respect to payment of dividend? If I am an Indian company, I am making payment of dividend to a foreign resident. Prior to 2020, I was subject to dividend distribution tax. After 2020, again, the classical system has been restored in the Indian Income Tax Act, wherein the burden of paying tax is on the shareholder. Company is not subject to DDT. So what happens? If I'm making payment of dividend to a non-resident, I have two options. Either I deduct the TDS under the domestic law provision at the rate of 20% plus surcharge and cess, which is quite high. So I obtain, or the non-resident prefers to give me certain document and take the benefit of tax treaty. He would say, look, I am giving you tax residency certificate from 10F and whatever that you want, and give me the benefit of tax treaty. What used to be the situation prior to MLI? There were two objective conditions that were always, one subjective and one objective condition that was supposed to be fulfilled. One condition was related to beneficial ownership. That condition was inserted into the tax treaty because of the treaty shopping issues. When I am making payment to a non-resident, I will say that if you are a beneficial owner of the income you are receiving, then you will be allowed to take a concessional tax rate of the tax treaty, a reduced tax rate instead of 20%. If you are not the beneficial owner, you would be denied the benefit. What do we mean by the term beneficial owner? We'll discuss it later, but in simple way, if I convey, beneficial owner is the one who is not contractually or otherwise liable to repatriate its earning to its parent or any other entity. He is the real owner. In simple way, I would say the income that he is receiving from India or any other country. Then there's an objective condition, holding. So typically every tax treaty says that generally the withholding tax rate would be 15%. However, if you hold 20% or more, 25% or more, we will reduce it to 10% or 5% as the case may be. If both the tests were applied on the date of distribution of dividend when I'm paying the dividend, then what was the issue of the mischief that was sought to be remedied by way of MLI? What people used to do, they used to have a holding percentage of more than 20 or 25% or the beneficial ownership prior to the date of declaration of dividend or distribution of dividend, and thereafter immediately they used to change their status either by diverting or selling or making disinvestment of their shares or reducing their holding percentage, or else they would have sold the shares of the company. They would have disentitled themselves from the ownership of the company. So there used to be sort of treaty shopping arrangement that used to happen. What MLI says that if you are giving a dividend to a resident or a national of a foreign jurisdiction, you have to satisfy two tests. One, Article 7.1 principal purpose test. Second, Article 8 of the MLI, which directly modifies the dividend article contained in tax treaty. 7.1 we have seen there has to be a commercial rationale. It should not be driven purely, or motive should not be purely to obtain the benefit of tax treaty. Article 8 is what I have reproduced on the screen. It says that provisions of the cover tax agreement or a tax treaty that exempts the dividend paid by a company which is resident of contracting jurisdiction from tax, or that limit the rate at which dividend may be taxed, provided the beneficial owner or the recipient is a company which is a resident of other jurisdiction and which owns, holds, or controls more than certain amount of capital, etc., or ownership interest of the company paying dividend, it shall apply. So just to summarize, the benefit of a reduced tax treaty rate given in the tax treaty will be available. Now the bold line I will read. Only if the ownership condition described in those provisions are met throughout a 365-day period, which includes the day of the payment of dividend. Now they are saying okay, you should be owner of the shares at least for 365 days. With this condition, the other condition, the objective and subjective condition which we discussed, that beneficial ownership and holding percentage, that is still going to remain. That will not be removed. What is added is an additional condition of ownership period, that you should be holding the shares for a period of 365 days. And it should include the day of payment of dividend. But there's no clarity as to whether I should hold the shares prior to the date of declaration of dividend. Is it mandatory or not? Or I can hold the share from the date of declaration of dividend till next 365 days. There is no clarity on that aspect. But OECD is silent. Explanatory statement to multilateral instrument is silent. But the UN Model Convention in 2017, which was updated, it gave a guidance that it can be both. Even holding the shares prior to the date of payment of dividend would also be counted for the purpose of 365 days. So this is an additional condition, an objective condition which need to satisfy. So if being a chartered accountant, I'm certifying some documents in Form 15CB, I need to check this additional condition either by way of obtaining a declaration or by calling for the specified documents that yes, that company was the beneficial owner. It held certain percentage of equity shareholders, and those shares were held for a period of 365 days. Then only I can take the reduced benefit of tax treaty. Otherwise, I can't. Similar exactly provisions have been introduced on same lines with respect to the capital gain transaction. I have not captured it here in the interest of time. Let's understand one transaction. There's a company called BICO, which is resident of country B. It is a 100% holding company. Country A, which is resident of ACO. ACO again in turn has a 100% holding in Indian company. Now, there are two transactions which are happening here. ACO is contemplating to sell its 100% share in an Indian company on a particular date, say 31st December 2021. Second transaction is Indian company is contemplating to declare and distribute dividend during, or rather I would say as on 1st April 2021, at the beginning of the year. And capital gain transaction is thought to be made at the mid of the year. The issue to be examined is the eligibility of ACO, which is a foreign company from an India perspective, the benefit of a reduced tax rate provided in the dividend article, as well as the benefit of a capital gain article in the tax treaty. Let's fairly assume that ACO has adequate substance in country A in one situation, and in situation two, let's assume that ACO doesn't have the adequate substance in country A. We have two assumptions. Both countries have notified Article 678 of the multilateral instrument, that both are the party to the multilateral instrument. And capital gain is subject to tax in country A due to treaty rights. However, same is exempt under the domestic law of country A. So it's similar to India, Mauritius. So if I'm making payment to, like prior to grandfathering, if I'm making pay, if the Mauritius company is selling the shares of an Indian company, the capital gain right to tax the capital gain transaction rests with the Mauritius, whereas Mauritius doesn't have the domestic law which taxes the capital gain transaction. Therefore, the capital gain is nowhere subject to tax. So in this situation, there are two transactions. One is payment of dividend, another is capital. Let's assume tax authority says that you are not entitled to take the benefit of tax treaty between India and country A because you have entered into this transaction solely to avoid the capital gain tax in India, and they do not allow you the benefit of tax treaty. You are not disputing that. That's okay, fine. Then there is another transaction of dividend. Can the tax authority say that although you are satisfying all the conditions, but I will not give you the benefit of tax treaty because you have already misused the tax treaty in respect of a capital gain transaction? So in short, what I'm trying to say if the benefit of tax treaty is rejected or not granted in respect of one stream of income, can somebody say that the benefit cannot be taken for any other income? The answer to this is no. If the benefit is not granted in respect of a particular person, in respect of a particular income, with the same purpose, with the same person, for the same country, you can take the benefit of tax treaty in respect of the other transaction. So dividend transaction, you can take the benefit. Capital gain transaction, you may either waive it, or you may govern yourself in domestic law, or you may dispute it. So that is the clarity I wanted to bring in. So if there are transaction of, let's say, royalty FTS, at the same time there's a transaction of dividend, and when a chartered accountant is taking, let's say, sort of an opinion that for dividend transaction, there's a treaty abuse that is happening and domestic law needs to be provided, tax treaty benefit cannot be claimed. With respect to royalty FTS, blindly the same approach cannot be followed, because both the transactions are different, that have happened at different point of time, and treaty abuse needs to be seen on a transaction by transaction basis, not entity per se. What are the factors that one needs to be mindful of when checking the conditions of, let's say, satisfying the condition of beneficial ownership or condition of principal purpose test or preamble? So this is one very interesting matrix, PURC, possession, use, risk, and control. Besides commercial rationale, establishing the commercial rationale, this is a test one should really look at. One is the possession. When you are making the payment to somebody, you need to check that person is not under contractual constraint or under any other constraint to pass on the income he is receiving to somebody else. So in our case, Mauritius example, I'm not paying income to Mauritius to upstream it to US automatically. Like Mauritius is the beneficial owner of that income. He has enforceable right over the income. Enforceable right, I mean, he has a right to receive the income. He has a right to hold the income he's receiving from India, and he has a right to enjoy that income. Nobody can blanket way ask that person to repatriate that money by contract or otherwise. Legal ownership is not necessarily a decisive test of a beneficial ownership. This we need to understand and learn very clearly. Merely because I'm giving payment to somebody in UK, who in turn repatriates that money to Singapore, I am claiming the benefit of India-UK tax treaty make available clause because that person is the legal owner of that income. No, you need to take a declaration to safeguard your interest that yes, he's the beneficial owner of that income. Don't go simply by the legal ownership, go by the substance, because now we are in the BEPS world. Payment to a nominee, agent, intermediary, trustee, authorship, fiduciary, administrator who merely has a legal title is not the beneficial owner. If you are making payment to any of those entities or persons in these capacities, you need to be very mindful of the implications. Use. The person has a right to use the income. He is not supposed to distribute it onwards. Risk. This is very important. The person who is receiving the money, he should be in a position to bear the risk which is arising on account of that transaction. It can be a foreign currency fluctuation risk. It can be appreciation or depreciation, risk of appreciation in the value of risk or depreciation in the value of risk. It can be in the form of damage or loss. If you are making payment to somebody who is, let's say in IT companies, usually this is the issue which everyone is facing. If a holding company is based in US, if a subsidiary is based in US and holding company is based in India, what happens usually, the tax authority says that subsidiary no doubt is having a significant revenue, but holding company is 1,000 times bigger than its subsidiary, and the entire risk is being borne by the parent itself, not the subsidiary. Subsidiaries may be a puppet of the holding company. So if that is the case, it raises the eyebrows of the tax authorities and it is seen with a suspicious nature. So it's very important that you advise your client to maintain minimum documentation to establish the commercial rationale of the transaction. Any transaction which is driven through the tax treaty benefit purpose, it's going to be disregarded without any kind of argument or discussion. because commercial rationale, if it is not there, judiciary is not going to give you the favor. Control over the disposition of income. He is not accountable to anyone in respect of income. So these are the factors that one needs to look at. So what is the, at the end of the day, what is our learning? If as a chartered accountant, I am certifying a 15 CB, I will continue to obtain the tax residency certificate even after the introduction of multilateral instrument. I need to check whether the TRC which I have obtained is a valid TRC for the period in which the transaction is undertaken. Kai bar, many times we obtain the TRC which is not effective on the day on which the transaction has happened. So it's very important you look at the TRC, and when you look at the TRC, you need to check the content of the TRC, whether it contains the name of the company, period, address, its tax identification number, seal and signature of the tax authority. All these are very crucial, because merely obtaining the TRC without having sufficient content as per the income tax rule is not sufficient. You need to look at it and ask for the additional document. So therefore, we have Form 10F if the information contained is not sufficient. Besides principal purpose test and other provisions of the MLI, you also consider the GAR provisions under the domestic law. And if it is not practical to establish the commercial rationale of the transaction every time, it's minimum expected that you obtain a suitable declaration. What should be the content of declaration? We will see ahead as we go ahead. LOB clause. So LOB clause is basically, again, is an anti-abuse provision, which says that if certain objective conditions are fulfilled, only then the person to whom you are making the payment can take the benefit of tax treaty. Otherwise, he cannot. Since LOB clause is present in a very limited number of tax treaty that India has signed, I am not getting into much detail as of now, but it's very fair to say that it's on lines of the other anti-abuse provisions. Other are subjective provisions. This is a very objective provision. This is traditionally what we have been following till date. Point number 5, you need to check not only the DTAA, but also whether the DTAA stands modified by the multilateral instrument. You need to follow certain steps. What are the steps? Check whether the conditions of PPT are satisfied, obtain a suitable declaration. In case of a dividend transaction, verify the holding period of the shares. Check if the transaction constitutes a permanent establishment for the recipient in India, if the income from the transaction can be attributable to the PE of the recipient in India. Obtain a suitable declaration. In case the multilateral instrument is effective, it is notified with respect to that country. Seek a declaration which includes the modified definition of a permanent establishment. I'll just touch upon it very briefly once I conclude this. Then thereafter, in case of dividend, interest, so we often, when we discuss with the chartered accountant, we come across the view that they say that pursuant to MLI, the change is only with respect to dividend, capital gain, and the permanent establishment definition. So far as royalty, interest, and FTS is concerned, they are not supposed to look at it. But bear in mind, the principal purpose test starts with a non-obstant clause. And this PPT test requires that for every payment that you make, when you are taking the benefit of treaty, you need to ensure there's a commercial rationale to the transaction. And if it is there, only then you can take the reduced rate of tax treaty. So you need to satisfy the PPT test, preamble test, LOB test at least in order to take the benefit of tax treaty. So this is important. Undertaking that one needs to obtain. So as of now, we take the simple no PE declaration undertaking, but going forward, one needs to ensure that the declaration should mention that the person who is a foreign resident is a person within the meaning of Article 3 of the tax treaty. He is a resident of the contracting jurisdiction and he has obtained the TRC. He does not have, or he do not intend to have, a place of effective management in India. He does not have or do not intend to create any permanent establishment in India. If the permanent establishment is there, then yes, it has to be explicitly mentioned, and the situation and the withholding tax rate would change accordingly. He is eligible to claim the treaty benefit and the person satisfies the principal purpose test. This is very important. Indemnity clause. Let's happen subsequently, the matter comes up in scrutiny and the foreign company is not able to establish the substance or not able to establish that it is able to take the benefit correctly, it has taken the benefit of tax treaty. The onus is on the payer under the domestic law of India that if he has availed the tax treaty benefit and he has taken the view that withholding is not applicable or it is applicable at a reduced rate, the consequences would be he would be made liable to pay tax in India along with the penalty and interest that may be applicable. Because they are not going to trace the non-resident. It's not practically possible. So take an indemnity clause, make it an agreement with the foreign company that if the situation so arises wherein tax authority holds you accountable, then they will indemnify you for the taxes or the penalty and interest consequences that you have to bear in India. And of course, then the beneficial ownership condition is satisfied. This should be at least or a minimum part of the tax treaty. This is just a list of tax treaty that gets modified pursuant to the multilateral instrument. How we can check it? So before that, I've just given a very simple flow chart. Process prior to multilateral instrument, everyone is aware, but process post multilateral instrument and how to check whether a tax treaty is getting modified by the multilateral instrument. This is a simple flow chart that one can follow, and you can take I'll share the PPT and you can refer it later on. You check whether India has notified the treaty with country A as a cover tax agreement. Practically, India has notified all the countries, barring that in respect of some of the articles, it has said that it will not. If the answer is no, if it is not a notified country, go with the treaty. Don't look at the multilateral instrument. And if you are going with the treaty, there is no MLI, there is no principal purpose test, dividend transaction, all those provisions that we discussed, those are not applicable. Those additional conditions are not applicable. If the answer is yes, it's a covered tax treaty. Whether it's notified tax treaty, then next question is whether country A has notified the tax treaty, because it's a two-way process. Merely because India says it's a cover tax agreement, it's not a cover tax agreement. It has to be both way. If the answer is yes, the next question is you need to check the substantive provision adopted by India and country A. So let's say, for example, India has said that its treaty will be modified by way of limitation of benefit clause, but the country A, let's say Netherlands, it has notified India. However, it has said that only PPT test will be applicable and limitation of benefit will not apply. In that situation, we need to stop there and we need to follow the principal purpose test. Next question, whether the provision, substantive provision, is a minimum standard. If it is a minimum standard and the countries are either silent, in that case, it is deemed acceptance and the tax treaty would stand modified to the extent of multilateral instrument. But if it is not a minimum standard, then it is an optional provision. Optional provision where you need to check whether the same option India and country A has adopted. Are there any reservations? Check the compatibility clauses. If the answer is yes, yes, in the sense there are reservations, there is not going to be any kind of modification to the treaty. The earlier treaty would prevail. However, if the answer is no, then the treaty would stand modified to the extent of multilateral instrument. This is a flowchart for easy understanding of everyone. Now let's, since we have time of 15 minutes, let's spend 5 minutes on the portion which we had left out. This is basically for each of the articles, the country position and its potential impact from an India perspective. Due to the constraint of time, and since my topic was restricted to 195, I didn't deal with all the topics or the topics on which India has reserved its position, because that's not going to any way impact us. I have restricted my discussion only to the extent of provisions which are very frequently going to be impacted. This is one of the concept which is actually incorporated in 2018 or 19, I believe, in the domestic law section 912 of the Income Tax Act. So what used to happen? India is a common law country. European region, most of the countries are the civil law jurisdictions. So what happens in those jurisdictions? Let's understand the permanent establishment concept. If a person who is resident of Singapore, he's doing business in Singapore, he's liable to tax in Singapore, fine, no issues. He wants to do business in India. Therefore, he set up a branch in India called a permanent establishment in India. And whatever activity the branch will do, the branch will be making payment of taxes in India to the extent of profit that is attributable to the branch. The taxes which have been paid in India will be available as a foreign tax credit in Singapore. The matter ends there. There are variety of or different type of permanent establishment exposures that are there. The one is the agency PE. What it says, if you are having an agent in India and that agent is purely dependent on you, that agent is negotiating the contract, he's bringing in the customers for you, and for that he is receiving the agency commission. But legally the Singapore entity is actually concluding all the contracts, it is bearing all the risk, it is earning all the revenue. So question arises, when the agent has been compensated at an arm's length price by way of payment of commission, whether Singapore company needs to pay additional taxes. That was a question. So Supreme Court in a couple of cases said that if agent is remunerated properly, there is no PE exposure because the agent is not concluding the contract. In that case, the foreign company is not liable to pay any additional tax in India. That was the situation prior to MLI. What MLI did, MLI said that if you are an agent who is not concluding the contract, but playing a principal role which leads to the conclusion of contract. What do we mean by the term principal role leading to the conclusion of contract? Let's understand in a simple example. There's a company called Apple in US. It has approached somebody in India. That person is discussing with or liaising with various dealers in India to purchase the iPhone or deal or take a distributorship of iPhone and sell it in India. He's doing the market research in India. He's doing everything that is possible in India in order to seek the contracts and make a sales in India. But he is not entering into any kind of contract. He is not concluding any kind of contract, either in its own name or in the name of the company. What he's doing is he's playing a principal role or substantial role, which leads to the conclusion of contract between Apple and India. So in this scenario, previously what used to happen, Apple would say it's an export from US, India would say it's an import in India. Contracts are not getting concluded. Contracts are concluded in US, therefore revenue doesn't arise in India. There is no permanent establishment exposure. I'm speaking in a very simple way. There are a lot of complexities are involved in this, but just to explain you the concept. Now they have changed it to, they have said that since the Indian agent is playing a principal role, which is leading to the conclusion of contract, the Indian agent would be treated as the permanent establishment of the US company, even though he is not concluding the contract. Now they have basically, or in a simple way, widened the scope of the agency PE rule. Whom is it going to impact? Most of the companies which have set up the subsidiaries in India or agents in India, or who are involved in the market research activity or supporting in the market segment, those countries are going to get impacted. As a chartered accountant or as a client, what do I have to do? When I am importing the goods from company X and I'm dealing with the agent of that company X, who is Mr. Y in India, that agent is doing all the activities. I need to take a declaration even for that import transaction to the effect that the foreign company with whom I am entering into a contract of purchase of goods, that is not covered by this agency PE rule, or it is not having any agency PE exposure in India. This is very important. Usually import transaction we blindly ignore, but now we need to look at the facts, look at the value of the contract. If it is material, one should seek the declaration under this provision. So with this, I think I'm done with the presentation. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take. if somebody is having doubt, I'll be happy to discuss it again, that concept. How to cross verify the correctness of the tax residency certificate. So practically, it is not possible because there is no mechanism that you can use that mechanism and verify that the tax residency certificate is correct. But cross verifying the correctness of the TRC means if something like somebody is, as I understand, somebody has given you a TRC, but that is not a valid TRC, you are saying. So there is no, as such, any mechanism. What you can do is, at best, you can go to the website of the respective country. Like in case of USA, you can go to IRS website. You can see to it whether there is any way to verify through some if there is a system in their domestic laws or on their website to check it. If the answer is no, then I think you can simply rely on it as it is. There is no mechanism provided either in the law or in the MLI to cross verify it. But if you have any suspicion or doubt about it, as I said, in SCAPS industry, it was held that if the tax residency certificate is not available, in that case, you can seek additional documents. If you have some doubt about the TRC, you can ask the certificate of incorporation. You can ask the acknowledgement copy, the redacted copy of the acknowledgement of the tax return filed by that company in its own tax treaty, in its own home jurisdiction. And you can also seek, if it's a public company, you can simply see the stock exchange of those country and see its own filings. And in the disclosure, you will see which country it is resident of. So on best effort basis, I think you should guide yourself. I think I have covered most of the points which are relevant from withholding tax perspective. On the procedural aspects, I'm not going like which form to take and all, because that we all are very well aware, and that is going to remain same as it was prior to MLI. Sangvi sir, any question?
I think there is no more questions left. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
I think there is no more questions left for attaining.
All right. So I presume that everyone has understood everything so well, and they'll now be able to apply the principles which we discussed, and that's nice.
I, on behalf of all the colleagues and Ahmedabad branch, would like to thank Karan sir for your time. Thank you for all the participants as well. We hope we can get another session from the sir in soon. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts.
Our pleasure to have you, sir.
Thank you.